All right, everybody, what is going on? We are here for our first NBA contest review slash flashback video of the season here. If you guys haven't been keeping up with them, they're actually in their own playlist now on our YouTube channel. If you go to our YouTube channel, you go to playlists, you are going to see reviewing past slates with contest flashback. We have 8 videos in here. Scott and I recently just did one for NHL. Max did his solo one last week. Max, appreciate you handling business while I was out, but I did miss our witty banter, as you called it, our back and forth. So I'm looking forward to this upcoming one on Monday here. And but we wanted to do one for NBA as well, right? NBA just started this week on Tuesday. We've had 2 big slates, 2 small slates. So we're going to be reviewing the contest, talking NBA strategy, how to use the contest flashback tool for NBA. It's actually available on all plans now, a new change that we just made this week here. So we opened up contest flashback to all SaberSim plans. So if you have been watching this video and be like, man, I wish I could jump in there and use some of these tools on some of like our standard plan. Well, hey, you can do that now. So this video is going to be, things that we're looking for and thinking about when talking NBA strategy here. So we're going to check out 2 contests, the Mega Eights, and which is the like higher dollar flagship contest, and then the fadeaway, which is the $15 flagship 150 max contest. So Max, if you're ready, let's jump in.
Yeah, and as always, I think we're going to sort of focus on not like the strategy for the slate, but sort of the higher level. What should I do in the future? How should I approach slates? How does this, what we're seeing, go into that? So just keep that in mind.
Right. So I have the Mega 8s pulled up. We're sorting by Sim ROI over here on the side. Did you want to check out like some ownership first, or you just want to go straight into the lineups?
Well, just looking at the players, I mean, I think the thing with this slate, if you played it, was the whole Dayron Sharp situation, because I think it was unclear who's going to be in the starting lineup. And, you get this at NBA where you'll have these centers who are 40 to 50 fantasy points per 36 minutes. So if they're projected at like 16 minutes, 18 minutes, like I assume that SaberSim was projecting Sharp for here, they're going to have really, really good value. And then sometimes you can get in these situations where you think, hey, they literally don't have anyone else to play. This guy has to play like 16 minutes. And then they end up playing like 4 minutes, which is what happened last night. So it is interesting. This is not an uncommon thing that happens. So I think that's interesting right off the bat. But let's look at some of the highest ROI lineups and see, what the constructions are like, because it certainly is interesting.
Cool.
I
So
think
let me
within
drop this players tab and then pop out some more lineups here.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting with NBA is, you're going to get a lot of guys who are going to get really high ownership. And the difference between NBA and NFL is, NBA, you can predict how well a player is going to do with like quite a bit of accuracy. So I think a lot of what we're going to see here, and not surprisingly, is that some of these high owned plays are going to be in the top lineups. But I think something that's interesting right off the bat is we're seeing SaberSim projected Sharp pretty highly, and he's not actually showing up in these top lineups, which is interesting to me. I think I'm seeing him in 1 out of 6. And
Right.
what that says to me is, if you have, well, I'm seeing maybe 2 out of 6. It's still sort of less than his ownership ended up being.
Right.
And so I'm thinking when you have sort of this high leverage situation where a player is low projected and his downside, right, is going to be like something that's going to straight up kill your lineups, that may be a spot, and maybe this is being results oriented, but that may be a spot where you can look to fade a little more. And that might work out for you. And keep in mind, this is also with SaberSim projecting Sharp, 21 and a half fantasy points, which had a lot to do with minutes, and that minutes projection was clearly wrong. And so that's just what's standing out to me right off the bat is you have a value center like this, and those are the spots where you might want to look to fade in the future.
I think something that really stands out to me here actually is some ownership difference between these top two Sim ROI lineups. Like Sim ROI wise, they're both very high, over 200%, but this first one is 232% some ownership, and then the second one comes in at 136% some ownership. And I think that a lot of people in NBA strategy think, okay, NBA is lower variance. NBA, the chalk hits a lot more. You're going to end up on a lot chalkier plays. But like this second lineup by Whistles is like, blowing my mind with the Dinwiddie, with the Podol, 2% ownership, 3% ownership, DeRozan at 6. Like, I find that like difference very interesting. How these two lineups can both get to the highest Sim ROI here. I'm seeing that almost all of these are like no more than two. I think that a general rule in NBA a lot of people follow is like, hey, no more than 3 players per lineup from the same team here. And a lot of these are, I see a 2-2 stack, 2 stack, 2-2-2, no stack, no stack, 2 stack. Like the 8 out of the top 9 lineups are using no more than 2 players from the same team here, right? So I think that is also an interesting takeaway for me.
That is very interesting. It is an 11 game slate though. So keep in mind, like as the games get less, you're going to actually straight up not be able to do that. But that is interesting because, in the Brooklyn situation, there's a lot of people out and they ended up using a 7-man rotation basically. So it is kind of interesting that you didn't see people shoving, 2 or 3 Brooklyn players more often than that. But that is interesting. I think I'd love to see just how some of these top players kind of constructed their lineups.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great pivot.
I think the thing is we get a lot of people asking like, what rules should I set? Like, how diverse is too diverse? And so there we go.
Chipotle Addict was our top Sim ROI player for the event here. And really quickly, before we get into his lineups, I think it's interesting that he had 3 lineups duplicated, right? He has 18 entries, and we're only showing 15 lineups unique, and he's still the highest Sim ROI player. So like right off the bat, like you have 3 lineups that are duped in a NBA 11 game main slate, but you're still the highest Sim ROI. Like I find that very interesting right off the bat before we even get into his type of lineups here.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're seeing that, he is doing some 3 stacks. Probably a quarter of his lineups do have 3 stacks. A lot of them have no stacks and 2 stacks. I personally set a rule where, especially when we're getting like 5 or 6 games at least, where I do no more than 3 players from the same team. And then also seeing right off the bat is, it's NBA. In order to get leverage on some of these players, you're going to have really high exposure, especially if you think they're a good play. And it seems like also some of the best players also can make really big mistakes. And we're seeing here that Chipotle Addict used 100% day run sharp. And that ended up really killing his lineups. But yeah, that's what's standing out to me right off the bat is the exposures here. They're really concentrated, and this is not like NFL where you can just get a lot of diversity and try to just sort of like hit the random high upside. You're just gonna have to just take some stance on some players in order to get leverage on them, because otherwise you might not get leverage on them at all.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are like playing the main sports, right? Playing football, playing NBA. Like, don't let that NFL mindset of how you handle exposures kind of trickle into your NBA strategy, right? Keep those things separate. A lot less injury risk in NBA, and kind of okay to be all in, right? So if you're telling me you're playing 100% of any running back, I'd be a little more nervous, right? Just because like injury rates are so much higher. But for NBA, I think that's totally fine.
You know what's interesting as well is I'm looking at Jakob Pertl, who is projecting really well, right? We have him at like 6 times value, and he came in at really low ownership.
Right.
And I think that sort of lends itself to a strategy thing for NBA is sort of the best way to find these sort of like high upside, low owned plays is to look for them at the center position because, you know, most of the time someone's just going to play one center in their lineup because you don't have that guard forward flexibility. And you can fit in two if you put the center at the utility, but that doesn't always work. And so when you have a situation where you have some really high owned centers, you can actually find some really nice leverage by looking at those centers who, you know, might project a little worse, that are going to get, again, when we're looking at NFL, the key here, if you can get like a 3%, 5% owned type of player that ends up working out really well, those are the types of plays that the contest simulator really likes. So I think that is standing out to me is just that's the place to look for in terms of, hey, if I'm going to try to get different, I'm going to try to pivot off of someone. I think that's the place where I'm going to first look when I'm playing NBA.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, to zoom out a little bit, right? A lot of people are still building with traditional optimizers, trying to fit in a lot of point per dollar plays, trying to pack in as many projected points as possible. When you have these two guys, like personally in my NBA process, I really like to look at upside in like 95th percentiles and just kind of when getting a feel for the slate, looking at these players and like you might see one player who has a better point per dollar value. And that player just gets put into so many more lineups when you build like in a traditional optimizer sense. Like you could switch SaberSim to optimizer mode and you can just kind of see like some of those players get jammed in. But then when you look at their upside, which is like really what you're optimizing for to win GPPs anyways, their upside is almost exactly the same, like if not, within a point or two there. And so to just say, hey, I'm okay playing the lower point per dollar play. One, because I don't think it's that bad. Two, I think that the ownership leverage I gain from doing that is going to be offset if this player does indeed have one of his higher upside outcomes. And I think that's like an easy way to get leverage, kind of piggybacking off what you said.
Yeah.
All right. You want to jump over to the flagship?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool.
I mean, I think it'll be interesting to look at this because in the 888, we're seeing a lot of players just sort of going pretty chalk and getting good ROIs. And I'm wondering if SaberSim in this bigger tournament, especially with, again, we're seeing Dayrun Sharp get pretty high ownership. And with, again, SaberSim projecting him pretty well, whether or not we see him last in some of these top ROI lineups, I think would be really interesting to see.
Let's come over here, sort by Sim ROI.
So this might take just a little bit of time because it's a bigger contest for sure. But no,
not so bad. Not so bad at all.
Yeah. And I think I am seeing that actually is I still don't see Dayrun Sharp anywhere so far. And hey, I think my thought was pretty good because you are seeing, if you look at some of these top lineups, you're seeing these center pivots where you're getting 4%, 3% owned centers that are making these lineup RIs really good. So I do think that's a really nice takeaway here is to look at that.
I do like,
yeah.
Or just one thing real quick. I do notice that almost all of these are using 49.9 salary or 50K salary, like just, jamming that salary in. I don't know what our default is for this. I think it might be 49,000 or 49.5. I don't really want to switch screens because I'm going to lose the lineups here and it's going to take me forever to get them back. But, I would say like kind of just looking at this, like don't be afraid to increase them in salary if you think it's a little low. So that's just one thing I did want to mention.
That's fine too. I mean, I'm also seeing looking at these sum ownerships, they're a lot lower in this contest.
Yeah,
So I think
especially
that, yeah,
top Sim ROI lineup below 100%. That stood out to me right away.
yeah. So I mean, that says to me that when you're playing these bigger contests or the flagship contests, you're gonna need to find some plays here that, and it doesn't mean just like fade the chalk completely, right? Like you can see that OCD of had Evan Mobley, who's high owned, and he has Chris Paul, who's high owned. But then there's a lot of these lower owned plays that end up making this lineup really high ROI. So I think in general, when you're playing these contests, you definitely, you could set a filter for your lineups or a rule to have a max ownership. You can manually try to get just more exposure to some of these low end plays or try to take stands on some of these high owned plays. I think, I hadn't looked at this before, but it really is standing out that, hey, you gotta get low ownership plays in your lineup in order to do well in these contests. So that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, another example here, like the top 15 lineups here, no more than no three stacks basically is like kind of my takeaway. And so I think that's something I'm going to think about here is that, hey, the more games on the slate, maybe I even try to use less players per team in these bigger contests and then maybe be okay with that in some of these like smaller fields. But that's standing out to me. The salary standing out to me. The ownership jump from these plus 200% sim ROI positive lineups in these smaller fields to these low hundreds, even possibly anywhere around that ballpark ownership lineups coming in really well in the Sims here. So, not going to be like setting any rules, but going to be, kind of spot checking my lineups, keeping those thoughts in my head. I don't think that, the point of this is to analyze one slate and then create a bunch of heuristics and rules and then use them for every slate from here on out. That's like not really what we're trying to do. We're just trying to understand like lineup dynamics and what the sim perceives to be the best lineups for any given slate and how we can use those as markers or signals for future slates.
Yeah, I mean, and if you actually click on a player, even like someone like Chris Paul, for example, just like click on, or just anyone really, but you can see why, these people are doing this. If you scroll down, you can see he actually has some anti-correlation here with like Steph Curry, and the correlations with players on the team are going to be people who get assists too, right? But usually, and if you looked at a player like Evan Mobley too, sure, these correlations, there's just gonna be negative correlations with players on the same team. And Evan Mobley, negative 0.07 correlation with Donovan Mitchell. So it does make sense here why people are a little hesitant to play a lot of players from the same team. Is this is not like football. These players do, cannibalize from each other. And so it makes sense why players are kind of hesitant to use 2-3 stacks. Definitely not using any 4 stacks because of this thing.
Right. And I think, something interesting here is that players' highest correlations are actually on the negative side. Like 0.02 correlation for Mobley is his highest positive, and then negative 0.09 is his lowest correlation. So those negative correlations in absolute value terms are actually much bigger than any of his positive correlations to any players in the game, which I find pretty fascinating.
Right. And even game stacking, right? Like I think people like to game stack, in these tournaments. But you can see like it's kind of like there's some landmines there. He actually is negatively correlated. Evan Mobley is negatively correlated to Chet Holmgren, who's on the opposite team. So it is interesting that, kind of these thoughts about, hey, let's get some correlation or try to get correlation in NBA. It's really about kind of avoiding negative correlation, avoiding players who are going to play together that are negatively correlated. You'll see this a lot where you have a bench player who's a good value and a starter who's a good value, and they kind of can't play at the same time or don't like to be played at the same time. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Right. Well, hey, I have filtered for our 150 maxers for this contest. Sorted by Sim ROI. Our man who came in first had the top Sim ROI lineup is indeed our top Sim ROI portfolio player as well here. So,
Yeah.
uh, another interesting thing, like, coming in with some duplicated lineups here in, this contest had 40,000 entries here. So, find that a little interesting. Let's hop over to stack exposures. And about 60, basically only like 20% of their lineups had more than a 3 stack or more here, but about 80% playing 2 stacks or less. So seeing
Yeah.
that right off the bat, even a couple 4 stacks falling in there here. Not too many, but interesting that, that's telling me that, hey, they're not setting any rule here. They're allowing it to come up if it ends up making it into their set.
Yeah. And I think it's not, it's not static. I think there's a particular type of team where that can be the case, and that's fine. So,
Right. Yeah, I
um,
think that, we talk about this a lot. Like as we get into the, later in the season into the dog days, the infamous Warriors sit all their starters, like handle those on a slate by slate basis. Like make sure you are looking at the slate rather than just coming in here and like pushing the buttons. Like I like to just come in and sort by value to start and like, hey, is there one team where they have, 4 out of the top 5 values and you can go and look at injury news. Like we always talk about the basketball monster news dashboard and just get some ideas about the slate and try and understand some of those slate contexts so you can update your strategy accordingly.
yeah, I mean, and then again, I feel like I keep saying this, but it really is sort of my takeaway here is I'm just looking at the centers that were played from this player, who by the way is in the SaberSim Discord and is a SaberSim user, but um, he really pivoted at the center position and actually kind of faded day run sharp. So that
Right.
just shows me like, hey, you know, I think that's just sort of the first place you're going to look to try to get different. And it ended
Yeah, I
up,
mean,
I
this
mean,
is
yeah,
massive leverage.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, massive leverage
DeAndre
with
Ayton,
DeAndre. Yeah,
3%, and they have him in 60. Wendell Carter Jr., 3%. They have him in 45. Like, we
yeah,
don't even see Sharp above 15% ownership. I don't know how far down I would have to go, but
yeah,
9%, right? And
right,
so like huge, massive stands here. But I mean, in these large fields, like in these top heavy structures, that could be a viable strategy. And the Sims are saying like, hey, this is a good strategy for this group of lineups overall, right? So
right.
definitely doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of leverage on Cam Thomas too. I don't, that could have had to do with how the starting lineup ended up playing out. Maybe this player saw something there where he's like, hey, they're not playing a center. And maybe Cam Thomas is going to play more than even SaberSim expected. And he would have been right. So that's certainly interesting. And then, after that, there's definitely some chalk in these lineups. It's not like they're so insane, right? But yeah, I think that's really all I see there. It's interesting. I mean, NBA, it's like you can't really say too much about the slate because things are going to change every
Mhm.
day, right? And
Right.
there's going to be less games and more games and different situations. There's so many different types of situations. It's really a sport where you have to just adapt to what is happening on the slate. Um, but
Right.
yeah, I mean, clearly he took some big stands, and our contest sim really, really like that. He's getting some lineups that are, 500% ROI, 400% ROI, 300% ROI, and obviously that's a lot of ROI. So he did very well doing this.
Yeah. Well, hey, this is kind of just like a video to show you guys, what we are looking for when we're looking into past contests for NBA. So this video will be up in those playlists that I mentioned earlier. You can come back to it, watch it over and over, see, what things to look out for, what kind of takeaways. We always tread lightly in these shows. I think that that's one thing that we do want to like reiterate here, like, hey, tread lightly. A lot of things change in NBA slate to slate, so don't try and just do one of these and then like, okay, I got my strategy for the rest of the season. So always be willing to adapt. I think that uncertain situations are the best place for you to spend your time, like the Nets, and then maybe pick a side of how you think that rotation or different things like that are going to play out. If you're like a more hand in the dirt player trying to do some additional research to help out your lineups. But Max, you got any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think my final thought is, this is a certain type of slate, right? And there's going to be other types of slates where you're going to have one really high salary player who's going to have a lot of ownership, someone like Giannis Antetokounmpo or Luka Doncic, where they're going to project really well. They're going to be project for 50% ownership. And I'm really curious what the contest sim is going to say for that type of situation or different types of situations like that.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that happened with Day Run Sharp in the slate is something that actually kind of happens rarely, but it is like a type of situation. And, when it doesn't go well, it really doesn't go well. And when it does go well, those types of players, if they can get like 25 minutes, can score like 40 fantasy points, and you absolutely need them. So it's sort of a high variance situation. But there's going to be a lot of different ones. And I recommend using Contest Flashback to just do this analysis, every so often, just to see, hey, okay, that was an interesting slate. This player is really high owned. Should I be using that player? If Luka Doncic gets 60% ownership on a 5-game slate, how should I go about this, right? So this is a really, really valuable tool, and I recommend revisiting it a lot during the season to help you with your strategy.
Yeah, I think that's like a perfect way to put it. I think in NBA there are so many main slates that sometimes you do get very similar situations, and like having those thoughts and reviews in your toolbox, in your mind, in your mental notes, there are just going to help you to make better decisions next time here. And then you have this sim ROI to reference and be like, okay, these were what the sims were saying were good. So you have a little more like I would say objective opinion like from the sims about what it thinks is good over a 100k sim sample here. But that wraps it for this show, everybody. Hope you guys enjoyed this. We look forward to hearing of all of your winnings in the NBA season, and we will be back next week for our NFL review show. So until then, take care, guys. We'll see you. Thanks.
Okay.